morning, everyone. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square, and welcome to a special edition of First Draft, where I talk with authors about their important work and the stories behind them. I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Paul Offit. He is a pediatrician who directs the Vaccine Education Center, and he serves as an attending physician in infectious diseases at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's an internationally recognized expert and co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine. He has authored more than 160 papers and 11 books. And his leadership roles include service on FDA and CDC advisory committees. He's also received numerous honors, such as the Sabin Gold Medal and election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Doctor, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for asking me.
We have perhaps the most prominent anti-vaxxer in America who is now in charge of national health policy, RFK Jr. Did you ever think that this day would come?
No. And similarly, when he was confirmed for that position, I never imagined he would be able to get away with the amount of destruction he's been able to get away with.
And he made certain promises during those confirmation hearings, specifically to Dr. Bill Cassidy, a senator from Louisiana, a Republican, who has spent a great deal of time in his other career trying to increase vaccine rates. And that has been a very important policy plank for him. And, you know, he was crucial in getting RFK Jr. confirmed. And it seems to me that Kennedy was very successful in, telling people what they wanted to hear and then getting into power and doing exactly what he wanted to do.
Right. Senator William Cassidy, a Republican from Louisiana, called me several times before that hearing, including the night before the hearing. And then when he finally voted to confirm, and Cassidy knew exactly who Kennedy was. He knew that he'd been an anti-vaccine activist. He knew he'd been a conspiracy theorist. He knew that he'd been a science denialist. But nonetheless, when he was confirmed, he held up a piece of paper, like this piece of paper, and said that he would be having an unprecedentedly close working relationship with Secretary Kennedy. And then he listed a series of things that he'd agreed to. He said that Kennedy agreed that he would work within current approval and safety monitoring systems when Kennedy subsequently fired all 17 members of the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices. He said that he'll maintain the CDC's ACIP recommendations without changes, and then proceeded to change those recommendations when he recommended against giving a COVID vaccine to children or against giving a COVID vaccine to healthy pregnant women. And then he said that he would not remove statements on the website pointing out that vaccines do not cause autism, when that's exactly what he just did. And every time, Senator Cassidy stood back and watched it happen.
You were also removed this year from the FDA's Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, and that's central to evaluating vaccine safety and efficacy data for approval. And you were just one of many. I mean, RFK Jr. has really cleared house on a lot of these panels. Walk us through some of his most dangerous actions at HHS and what that will mean for Americans' health, both in the short and the long term.
And international health, I think, not just in this country. But Absolutely. I think, what did he do? He, despite presentations by the CDC, that over this past year, between 200 and 400,000 people were hospitalized with COVID and 30 to 50,000 people died. He's done everything he can to discourage COVID vaccination use. He's got his sycophants at FDA, people like Vinay Prasad at CBER, saying 10 children died of COVID vaccine without providing any data, one shred of information as to why that was true or in what manner it was true. He has said that he doesn't think healthy pregnant women should get a vaccine when we are the only country in the world that does not consider pregnancy to be a high-risk condition for severe COVID. He removed our funding, our commitment to the Global Alliance Vaccines and Immunization Group, which has been for 25 years a light in making sure that more than 1 billion doses of vaccine have been administered in the developing world, which has saved an estimated 20 million lives. He backed away from that. He's now canceled $500 million in the Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority, which will seriously hurt our ability to respond to a bird flu pandemic should it ever happen. It's been one nightmare after the other, and most recently on December 5th, his new look ACIP, his science averse anti-vaccine ACIP has just basically said that that if you are born to a mother who doesn't have hepatitis B infection, you can choose to get that vaccine or not, which ignores the fact that half of the children less than 10 years of age in this country got hepatitis B from a source other than their mother. So he's only put children at risk. He no doubt will cause children to suffer and be hospitalized and die. And he is unlikely to ever be held accountable for it.
I know there were just articles of impeachment introduced by a Democratic congresswoman. Obviously, with Republicans controlling the House, nobody expects that to go anywhere. Donald Trump does not seem to have any desire to remove RFK Jr. And so he seems really emboldened to just keep going with this agenda. What I'm wondering is, when you look at some of the actions that President Trump takes, where, you know, his top priority has been giving tax breaks to his wealthy friends. He has profited handsomely off the presidency. You can see the logic in what he's doing and with his agenda. What does RFK Jr. get out of these policies that are just making us sicker, that are causing people to die, that are destroying medical research? Is this just, is it the thrill of playing God? Because it's hard to understand, because disease doesn't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. It's coming for all of us if we don't take certain measures.
I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a zealot. And his zealotry surrounds vaccines. I mean, for 20 years, he's been saying the same thing. He said it when he ran for president in 2024, which is that he believes that vaccines have merely lessened the incidence of infectious disease at the cost of causing chronic diseases. And he is on a mission. And his mission is to make vaccines less available, less affordable, and more feared. And if given the opportunity, and he's getting close to being given that opportunity, he would eliminate vaccine use in this country. You'll hear groups like his group, Children's Health Defense, at a recent meeting in Austin, Texas, say they want to make it so that no vaccines are manufactured in the United States. That's where RFK Jr. is coming from. I don't think people realize how bad this is. If you read his book, for example, which I don't recommend, The Real Anthony Fauci, in pages 285 to 288, he tells you where he's coming from, which is that he does not believe in the germ theory. He doesn't believe that specific germs cause specific disease, which is not theoretical anymore. It's been pretty much established since the mid-1800s. He doesn't believe that. He believes in the so-called terrain theory, which is as long as you're healthy, as long as you're well nourished, as long as you take your vitamins, you're not going to get serious disease. And when those two little girls died in West Texas of measles, the first child death of measles in this country since 2023, he said they needed to take vitamin A. People need to take vitamin A, which, by the way, is irrelevant in a developed world country. I mean, the incidence of vitamin A deficiency in this country is less than 0.3%. Vitamin A doesn't work to treat measles. It doesn't work to prevent measles. And if you're a pregnant person taking vitamin A, you increase your risk of delivering a child with severe birth defects. So he's just a zealot who is unchecked. And the reason he's unchecked is that only one person is really paying attention, if he's paying attention at all, and that's President Trump. That's it. I think RFK Jr. knows that he is free of any congressional oversight. The only person he continues to kiss up to is President Trump. But President Trump is also an anti-vaccine activist. He is. President Trump recently said he thought the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine should be separated into its three component parts. He has recently said that he thinks the hepatitis B infections were only occurring in people who are sex workers or people who are intravenous drug users, and that's not true. I mean, half the children in this country in 1991, less than 10, roughly about 8,000 children got hepatitis B from coming in contact with someone who had chronic hepatitis B infection, and most of those, of whom there are millions in this country, most of whom don't know it. That's how those children got infected. Half got it from their mothers, half didn't get it from their mothers, and they didn't get it less than 10 years of age because they were sex workers or intravenous drug users. So he doesn't know that. It's okay that Donald Trump doesn't know that. He's a real estate person. But in theory, RFK Jr. should know, but he doesn't know it either.
there's a seductive argument that a lot of people in the anti-vax movement, the wellness movement make, where if you just exercise enough, if you just have the right diet, that your health is going to be perfect and it's all within your control. And obviously, there are millions, billions of dollars to be made by selling those ideas in various ways to people. But I mean, fundamentally, that's an argument of eugenics, because there are a lot of things that are not within our control, whether it's environmental factors where people live. I live in Michigan. In Detroit, we have some of the highest asthma rates for children just because of where they live. That's something that's beyond their control. There's heredity. A lot of us have cancer that runs in the family. You can't outrun that necessarily, even if you do everything right. And so, by getting vaccinated, that's one of the best ways that we can try and prevent some of these horrible diseases that used to ravage generations. But instead, RFK Jr. and his ilk are selling this idea that no, your health is totally within your control, especially if you buy the products of my friends here. How has this gained so much popularity well before he got into Trump's cabinet?
Well, it's seductive. The notion that you're in total control of your health is seductive. I mean, the old joke, and it's not a joke, is the best thing you can do for your health is be very careful about which parents you pick to have as your parents, because genetics is critical, right? And I do think a lot of this "Make America Healthy Again" movement is sort of a wellness and alternative medicine grift. I see that a lot. And people like Kaylee Means. I mean, Casey Means was up for being U.S. Surgeon General. I mean, who wrote a book called The Good Energy. You listen to RFK Jr. saying he was walking through an airport recently and he looked into the eyes of children and saw that they had a bad mitochondria. Like, what are you talking about? And that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the sort of good energy, bad energy stuff. You're right. We are only in so much control. Sure, sleep well, eat well, exercise, all for it. But you're still limited in many ways by your environment and your genes.
I'm struck by the fact that there is a huge industry that behind this. I mean, RFK Jr. personally has made millions with his many lawsuits, representing the Children's Defense Fund and all of their suits. Many people have made, money off of these wellness products, that promise things that clearly they can't deliver. But at the same time, a big argument that seems to be persuasive to people is that, public health officials are somehow on the take from big pharma. They're somehow secretly making a lot of money, and that's why they're pushing these evil vaccines on you. Which just seems to be, flipping what's really happening here. And I'm just wondering, how do you effectively counter that kind of propaganda? Because, look, a lot of people don't like how much they pay for prescription drugs. I mean, that's another seductive argument.
No, you're right. It's hard. I mean, certainly there are instances where pharmaceutical companies have acted aggressively or unethically or illegally. Probably the opioid epidemic is probably the best example of that. And so, you can see how in some ways they weren't to be trusted. But the fact of the matter is the wellness industry is probably 3 times greater than the pharmaceutical industry. And there are certainly in the world of children, especially regarding vaccines, there are systems in place to make sure that if there ever is a problem with a vaccine, it'll be very quickly picked up in so-called phase 4 post-marketing studies through things like the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System or the Vaccine Safety Data Link. So there is no hiding. I mean, even if pharmaceutical companies wanted to try and cheat, they wouldn't get away with it for long because of these systems in place, these surveillance systems. But you're right. We live in an age where conspiracy sells. We live in an age where terms like deep state have cachet. To try and convince people that there's dark, evil forces working behind the scenes to do us harm is really hard to do that. And so it's a struggle. And I think that's how especially anti-vaccine activists win. They point to people who work in the vaccine world and say, well, you're all just deeply in the pocket of the pharmaceutical industry, but they're also deeply in another pocket. I mean, There's this one guy, Aaron Siri, who is a lawyer that's hired by the Informed Consent Action Network, whose law firm was paid something like $6 million in 2023. It's been paid, upwards of $20 million since 2018. I mean, that they are a well-funded group, and they're the first ones to point fingers and say, you guys are in the pocket of somebody. When in fact, most of the people, virtually all the public health people who stand up for vaccines aren't in the pocket of anybody. They're only in the pocket of children, trying to make sure children are well protected.
And, I, as a journalist, have covered public health officials for years. Your county public health officials are not millionaires. These are public servants. Nobody is living in McMansions off of this. And ironically, perhaps the biggest success of Trump's first term was Operation Warp Speed, where he worked with, the government worked with pharmaceutical companies with existing mRNA technology for the COVID vaccines, which study after study has shown has resulted in saving millions of lives here and abroad. And so, for whatever hostility there is against pharmaceutical companies, there's no doubt that the vaccines that were developed in record time for COVID have been a lifesaver. And there's a huge benefit to humanity for that.
I think Operation Warp Speed was one of the greatest scientific or medical achievements in my lifetime. I mean, here's a virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus, that was isolated and sequenced in January of 2020. By February of 2020, 1 month later, this virus came into this country and was killing people. And you would have as many as hundreds of people dying a day. In only 11 months after sequencing that virus, we had 2 large prospective placebo-controlled clinical trials of the mRNA vaccines by Pfizer and Moderna, because Operation Warp Speed took the risk out of it for pharmaceutical companies. So we went very quickly from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 trials to manufacturing millions of doses, with the companies knowing that if the vaccine didn't work, it didn't cost them a thing. They could throw away millions of doses and pay nothing. And for that, we were able to probably save between 3 and 3.5 million American lives because of that effort. Donald Trump's administration arguably did one of the greatest things I've ever seen in my life for vaccines. And then he turns around and becomes, in many ways, an anti-vaccine person. But I think President Trump has been anti-vaccine really since 2015.
Yeah. I mean, during that first presidential campaign, he was, raising these questions about vaccines causing autism. And, so there is a long history of him playing footsie with that movement. So I've been covering anti-vax efforts more at the local level for years, long before the pandemic. And it was largely driven by, suburban moms who were kind of into this wellness movement. And, they said they were just concerned about their kids' health. And I'm a mom. And yes, nobody wants to see, your baby or your kids cry when they get their shots. But, I've always felt that's a very small price to pay to make sure that they won't die of polio or measles like too many in their grandparents' or great-grandparents' generation. But, there's some appeal. You want to save your kids some sort of short-term pain. I get that. And, there's all this disinformation about what's in the shots and what kind of impacts there could be. It seems to me that the biggest driver of this is that there is just information overload online. It is so easy to get bad information. And everyone now feels like they're an expert, rather than ask their pediatrician, they'll just go to Google and they can get a lot of just absolute crap. So how is it for us to look into misinformation, and what do we do about this problem?
So I think it's twofold. One is that we don't remember these diseases. I mean, I was a child in the 1950s. I mean, I had measles, I had mumps, I had German measles, I had chickenpox. We eliminated measles from this country, a virus that caused almost 50,000 hospitalizations and 500 deaths a year. We eliminated that virus by the year 2000. So we've eliminated it 25 years ago. But I think not only did we eliminate it, we eliminated the memory of measles. People don't remember how sick or dead that virus can make you. I mean, when people would come into the hospital with measles, when I was training, I could tell whether they had measles in 30 seconds because they were sick. I mean, as distinct from other viruses that cause fever and a rash. And I don't think we remember it. And because we don't remember it, we're less compelled by the disease. And because we're less compelled by the disease, we're much more compelled by safety issues, real or imagined, which are unfortunately too readily available online. All this misinformation about COVID vaccines and other vaccines. And I mean, you have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services, within a few weeks of his being confirmed, went on national television on Fox News and said, measles vaccine causes blindness and deafness. Measles vaccine causes deaths every year. Measles vaccine causes the same symptoms of measles. All that is wrong. And nobody said anything. I think at that moment he knew he was free of congressional oversight. And he said it in the midst of the biggest measles epidemic we've had in this country in 33 years. I mean, that's who RFK Jr. is. And he gets away with it. And people, I'm sure some people believe it. Why should I get a vaccine that's going to cause blindness and deafness when obviously it doesn't? And when he met Peter Marks, who was then the head of Centers for Biological Evaluation and Research at the FDA, RFK Jr. said to Peter Marks, I want you to show me the data where measles vaccine causes blindness and deafness. And Peter Marks says, there are no data. The vaccine doesn't do that. And so he fired Peter Marks. That's who RFK Jr. is.
Yeah. So, for the last couple of decades, we've seen this growing anti-vax movement in this country, and it was well before COVID, but it really did seem to explode into the mainstream during the pandemic. It seems like the makeup of that movement has changed more from it being maybe some concerned moms. It didn't necessarily have a political ideology. And now it definitely has infected our politics. And it's become part of the MAGA movement. And kind of it's shifted more from women at the forefront to, a lot of men, like you were saying. I was seeing like a lot of angry men attending school board meetings, against vax mandates that didn't exist for COVID, and they didn't even have children in the school. Can you talk with us a little bit about the impacts of now having one of our two major political parties embrace this ideology and have the power to put these policies into effect at the national level?
Yeah, so I think to some extent, vaccination will always be political because it requires, to all public health, requires resources. So therefore, there will always be, to some extent, a politics, but it doesn't have to be partisan. And I think your point is exactly right. I mean, if you look, there was never a politics, meaning right or left, to the anti-vaccine movement. On the left, it was, don't put anything unnatural in my body, anything with a chemical name. I mean, I want to live a natural lifestyle, sort of the crunchy granola, big overall Southern California crowd. And in fact, there was an outbreak of measles in 2014, 2015 that centered on the area around Disney. Then it was really largely a left-leaning group.
Yeah.
Right, it was always government off my back. Don't tell me what to do. Don't mandate vaccines. Now it's swung wildly into that direction. Is this government off my back? And I think the medical freedom movement is that. It's which is really at variance or counters public health, because public health at some level, you have to care about your neighbor. When you're saying, I'm going to do whatever I want to do independent of how it affects my neighbor, then you don't.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of people and celebrities seem drawn to anti-vax conspiracies and propaganda, like Joe Rogan or Liam Neeson just, I guess, narrated a documentary that came out recently. It's because of this idea that advocates have said it's just about asking questions about safety, especially for kids. And there's also this like debate me bro mentality that the anti-vax movement has. And they consider it to be a big gotcha moment when physicians and epidemiologists won't engage in these bad faith discussions with them. You've argued, of course, that vaccine safety is not something that you debate. It's something that you prove through evidence. So what do we do when Americans would rather trust their favorite celebrity than scientists who spend their life studying these things?
I know, the issue of vaccine safety is a scientific issue. therefore, meaning does MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine cause autism? Is a scientific question. It can be and has been answered in a scientific venue. And by scientific venue, I mean you gather epidemiological data, you rigorously evaluate it, you write it up, and you submit it to an excellent medical journal, which is then reviewed by subject matter experts who will decide that your conclusions do or do not or are not supported by your data. That's the way it works. And then preferably that observation is reproduced by other investigators. That's how it works. So for example, I mean, we know that the RotaShield vaccine, which was introduced in the United States in 1999, was a rare cause of intestinal blockage, and those data were submitted to the New England Journal of Medicine and reproduced by others. We knew that Guillain-Barré syndrome, this rare cause of ascending paralysis, could be a consequence of the 1976 swine flu vaccine. We know that thrombocytopenia and clotting is a rare consequence of the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine, but which could be fatal, which was submitted, to a journal vaccine and published, and ultimately drove that vaccine off the market. So if you have a vaccine safety issue, great, prove it. Do what the rest of us do. Prove it. Submit it to peer review through excellent journals. But they don't do that because they don't have the data. And because they don't have the data, they say, okay, well, let's debate it. And in a debate, 5 minutes into it, nobody knows who the expert is. They're far more confused because the facts are confusing, and you're just arguing. Basically, what you're saying is, well, that's not true. Well, that's not true. Well, that's not true. It's just not the way to debate. You might as well debate whether birds are real. I think I could take the other end of that debate, by the way. I could take the other end of the birds aren't real debate. I would say that, yeah, sure, you've cut it open and you see like a beating heart and stuff, but this is how good robotics are these days. And, and when you see the birds like up on a wire, they're recharging. That's what they're doing. And they're made in China, but they're constantly moving where the site is in China. I mean, you can argue that birds aren't real.
It definitely seems like the goal is just to muddy the waters. And one of the other things that RFK Jr. has tried to implement at HHS is, he doesn't want peer-reviewed research. Anything, that goes through typical scientific journals that have been established for decades or centuries, they're all biased. And so that doesn't mean anything. And they just want to produce their own evidence. And now they have, the force of the US government. They can put out papers and say, here you go, vaccines cause autism, and cause more confusion and more death, more destruction. How do we unwind this? There will be, God willing, a post RFK Jr. era. How are we going to unwind all of this damage?
Okay, so I'm an optimist because I am a Philadelphia Eagles season ticket holder. But in any case, here's what I would say. I do think science wins out in the end. Historically, science wins out in the end. So when RFK Jr. stood before that second confirmation hearing of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee, where Senator Cassidy was the lead, Kennedy held up a paper and said, look, here's gold standard science. Here's a paper, and it wasn't published. It wasn't published in the scientific or medical journal. It was a WordPress blog that basically he made up called Science, Public Policy, and the Law, something like that. And it didn't really have an editorial review board. It was just a group of anti-vaccine activists who were the reviewers. And it claimed that this Florida Medicaid program showed that vaccines cause neurodevelopmental delays, it was methodologically horribly flawed, which is why you would have never been able to publish that study. But for the casual observer who doesn't necessarily know the difference between an excellent journal and just this bogus, made-up throwaway journal that it wasn't even a journal, it's hard for them to figure that out. And so RFK Jr. is, for the next few years that he's in this position, is going to continue to do what he's been doing. He said the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine caused autism, even though 24 studies showed that it didn't. He said thimerosal, this ethyl mercury containing preservative that was in vaccines up until about the year 2000 given to young children, caused autism, when 9 studies have shown that it didn't. And the incidence of autism has only increased over the last 25 years, during which time we've taken out of vaccines for young children. Then he steps up in front of the microphone and he says Tylenol, given in the first trimester of pregnancy, causes autism, when 2 excellent studies, huge studies, doing the right kinds of sibling controls done in Japan and Sweden, showed that it clearly didn't. So he's going to keep saying it over and over again. But the fact of the matter is, vaccines don't cause autism. It's like Galileo. I mean, when Galileo was brought up and censured by the Roman Catholic Tribunal for daring to say that the earth revolved around the sun, that the earth wasn't the center of the firmament, as stated in the Bible. He was put in chains, and I think was in chains for the rest of his life. But he said, as he was being led out of that tribunal, presumably in Italian, and yet he said, it still moves. Meaning, you can put me in chains. That doesn't change the fact that the earth revolves around the sun. And no matter how many times RFK Jr. says vaccines cause autism, or how many discredited doctors or discredited scientists or congressional representatives or media outlets he gets to echo that, it doesn't. And ultimately, good science does win out in the end, but it may take a while. And there'll definitely be damage in the meantime.
The problem is that it seems to me that RFK Jr. thinks that he's Galileo in this situation.
Whereas he's the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah. I wanted to talk specifically because autism seems to be a huge fixation of his. And the way that he talks about autism and people with autism, first of all, it seems like he may not really have a grasp of what it is, because he kind of describes this as like this terrible disease and disorder. And, instead of, this is just a different way that people function and process information. And, this is not a tragedy, but like somehow this has been a great wrong that has been done to their parents to end up with children with autism. And it seems like that's not really talked about very much in the context of what he's doing here. To me, he has done more to stigmatize people with autism than anyone else. And that's really damaging when you do have so many more people who are being diagnosed now than they have been in the past.
No, he catastrophizes this disorder, which really made a lot of parents of children with autism angry. He said, children with autism will never hold jobs, will never pay taxes, they have trouble going to the toilet by themselves, they'll never play baseball, they'll never marry. And obviously, he didn't see the Netflix series Love on the Spectrum, where they follow children who had grown up and married who had autism. So many people with autism are contributing members to society. I don't know what he's talking about, but by catastrophizing it, he just makes it sound all the more dire that we have to find this environmental factor, which he said autism, quote, autism preventable. It's an environmental factor, and we're going to find it. And we're going to announce what it is in September. And so he had Trump announce it in September that it was Tylenol given to the first trimester, which was also wrong. I mean, he's wrong and wrong and wrong. And you would think at some point the American public and the press would think maybe this is not the guy we should be listening to.
You would hope. I know it appears that we are stuck with RFK Jr. for a long time, but we do have midterm elections coming up next year. And conceivably, Democrats could win the House. Senate seems to be a long shot, but you never know. Could we start to finally see some oversight and some real efforts to contain the damage that he's doing?
Yes. So what ends this nightmare of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.? So President Trump could, but won't. I think Congress could, but at least as currently structured, won't. The third group who could are parents. I mean, most parents support vaccines. Republican, Democrat, Independent, doesn't matter. Most parents, more than 80% of parents support vaccines, and most parents support school vaccine entry requirements. I'm starting to get certainly far more emails from parents that are getting nervous, that they're scared about this measles outbreak, which is huge. I mean, if you look on the CDC website, it'll say there's a little more than 1,900 cases of measles. But if you talk to people on the ground, they think there's at least 5,000 cases and maybe more. And we're heading into December, January, February, March. I mean, measles pre-vaccine, pre-1963, was primarily a winter-spring disease. So I think that it's just, and now there's travel, there's holidays, you're going to see more measles. And so there's that. Then you had at least 10 pertussis, whooping cough deaths this year. We've had states that haven't experienced whooping cough deaths in years that are experiencing whooping cough deaths. We had almost 200 children die of flu this year. We haven't seen a number that big since 2009, since the swine flu pandemic. I think parents are getting more nervous, and we may get to the point where they march into their congressman's office and say, enough, I'm scared. I'm scared about what's going on, because they have power. I mean, were they to organize and make it an issue of electability, I think that would matter. But you're right, short of that, I think we may just have to wait for a regime change or a congressional change before we see movement.
I've noticed that there have been some big and subtle shifts in terms of the typical campaigns that you see in the fall for flu and COVID vaccines. And so when I went to get my family vaccinated for both, there were a lot more hoops to jump through at my local pharmacy than there had been the year before. And I kept kind of getting the subtle impression. They're like, are you sure you really want to do this? Are you sure you're really qualified? And for busy people, I could see how, that might be persuasive with some of these roadblocks that RFK Jr.'s HHS is putting up. They'd say, this just seems like a giant pain in the butt. Maybe I'll just table this and do this some other time. Clearly, there's a strategy at work. But I'm noticing from big pharmacies, Walgreens and the like, all I hear now is get your flu shot. Nobody is saying COVID. Like, that is too political at this point to even talk about. And I'm sure that is having a big impact on vaccination rates as well. I mean, I know since the initial vaccines were offered at the beginning of 2021, we've seen each time there's a new variation, a new booster out, the rates keep dropping, but I would think that we're going to see this time an even more dramatic fall off.
I think you're right. I mean, you're right. I mean, I get my vaccines from the pharmacist, and the laws for the pharmacist are a little different than they are, say, for the physician in the hospital, because the physician or nurse in the hospital is largely protected by the vaccine for injury compensation program. So if something is, for example, not recommended by the ACIP or softly recommended by the ACIP, the pharmacists may feel they're not protected. And so that's what happened. I mean, when RFK Jr. stood up and gave that 1-minute video on X, like in May, and said, we, HHS, are not recommending this vaccine for healthy pregnant women. I had emails from a number of pregnant women who said, I just went into my pharmacist and couldn't get the vaccine. Mm-hmm. It's based actually the lawsuit that's now moving forward in Massachusetts from a Chicago law group about that, representing women who couldn't get that vaccine. I mean, it is not a matter of dispute whether if you're pregnant, you were at increased risk of severe and occasionally fatal COVID, about 1.5 to 2 times more likely to go to the ICU and die if you're pregnant with COVID than if you're not pregnant with COVID, or that if you're pregnant and don't have COVID. So it's clear, the data are clear. And you're right. I think that's where things get confused. And you're right. Not just COVID isn't really being talked about. Respiratory syncytial virus vaccine for older isn't being talked about either.
And I believe ProPublica was the one that did just heart-wrenching reporting several years ago about all of the fetal deaths that were caused by women who didn't get vaccinated. Obviously we've seen from the Trump administration, they have been very focused on anti-abortion policy, but, they're supposed to be pronatal, and not getting vaccinated has a huge impact on, your fetus as well. But that doesn't seem to have carried any weight in terms of their policies, because RFK Jr. stood up there and said pregnant women shouldn't get this vaccine. I'm glad that you have hope for the future, because when I look at this and I look at what is coming out of our government in official policy, I just find it really frightening. And my children are no longer young and need all their shots, but there are millions of children out there that are not getting the vaccinations that they need. And that doesn't just have an impact on them. I don't need to tell you, obviously, but the way vaccination works is, we want to hit herd immunity to protect those who can't get vaccinated, people who are immunocompromised, and they rely on us to help them. And it pains me so much, because we're at a time where nobody should be dying of measles, and yet people are. To me, it's just a huge step backwards.
No, I think you're so right. Remember when there was that outbreak in California in 2014, 2015? It was a measles outbreak, started there, spread to about 25 states, involved 300 people. I think there was one death in the country. But what was interesting was there was a state senator named Richard Pan, who was a pediatrician by training, who stood up and wanted to eliminate the philosophical exemption from vaccinations in a state, California, that didn't have a religious exemption. So therefore, you would only be left with medical exemptions. And so the only way to get around that would be either to homeschool or to get a doctor to lie about whether there's a medical exemption. So the anti-vaccine people were there in force, against this, because nothing upsets them more than taking away their right to exempt themselves from vaccination. And there was a little boy, a little 7-year-old, whose name was Luke Crowett. And you can see him on video now on YouTube, but he was little, so they had to sort of put him up on a stool so he could reach the microphone. And he said, he told his story. He said, "My name is Luke. I have leukemia. I can't be vaccinated. I depend on you to protect me." He's looking right at the anti-vaccine activists when he says that. And then he said, "Don't I count?" And that should be the theme here. Don't they count? Don't the millions of people in this country who can't be vaccinated, who depend on those around them to protect them, don't they count? And I think the medical freedom movement basically says, no, you don't count.
Dr. Offit, I appreciate you taking so much time to speak with us. I know you also write on Substack, which is a great place for people to find your work who probably don't spend a lot of time reading scientific journals. And so I encourage everyone to look for your work there as well. Where else can people find you online so that they can get good information about vaccines?
So we have our Beyond the Noise Substack, which is probably the best place to find me. But I think we did a good job. Here we talked for almost 40 minutes with the title being "The Current State of Public Health," and didn't curse once. So I think that's good.
You know what? And that's a big accomplishment for me. Probably not for you. So, but Doctor, I appreciate you being here. I hope you have a very happy holiday. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us as well.
Thank you.